Now, I've talked a lot about NatWest Bank, about Coutts Bank, about other banks, about this very political culture that seems to have overtaken them. But we haven't talked enough about the FCA. We haven't talked enough about the regulator. Well, joining me is Professor Daniel Hodson, former Deputy CEO and Financial Director of Nationwide. And back to the glory days of the city, of course. You were boss of the London International Financial Futures Exchange, the Life Market.
I was indeed.
With its coloured jackets and
all that. And you were one too at the end.
I know, absolutely. Yeah. They were very interesting days.
They were.
Goodness me, we've moved a long way from that. Now, I've been looking, Daniel, at this, and Sheldon Mills is a very senior figure within the Financial Conduct Authority, and we learn that for many, many years, he was a director of Stonewall. In fact, the longest-serving director of Stonewall. Stonewall, an organisation that just, frankly, bully employers into making sure they are LGBT compliant, making sure that their private health cover, includes things like transition therapy, and then they rate employers, 1 to 100, and if an employer's not doing well, the Twitter mob are on their backs. We've got people like this deep within the Financial Conduct Authority, and what's been suggested to me is that in many ways they've actually been encouraging the banks and other financial institutions to become politicised.
I think that's true. I think the bottom line is that regulators should stick to regulation.
What a good idea.
And politics, important as they are, shouldn't be allowed to touch in the main what they do. And your example is a very good one. It is very unfortunate. Actually, this Sheldon Mills is chairman of Stonewall. And it's a great shame because certainly in my experience in terms of good governance, you would expect someone like that, if they had a conflict of interest, to declare it at any meeting inside the FCA and so on and so forth. And so the most important thing, though, is in the context of your particular experience recently, how the FCA and people within the FCA, senior people, have been expressing concern about the way that Alison Rose had to depart and that sort of thing. And that is not really appropriate, as I say. Regulators should regulate. They should stick to looking at things like market risk, like keeping markets safe, like competitive markets, rather than going into the political arena, albeit by virtue of the things that they're saying in the context of that sort of situation.
So who regulates the regulator?
That's a very good question. And it's certainly true that there should be a more formal regulation of the regulator. Of course, they do appear before select committees and so on in the House of Commons. Yeah. And that's important, and they are exposed in that way. But there are some deficits here. I think it's a great shame, and certainly in my experience, and I had a lot of experience, you did, of course, during the great market days, regulation is a hugely important part of good markets. We look, I think, in terms of making sure the City of London, which is, after all, our main economic driver in this country, it's the largest industry we have. It's
becoming hard to believe, but it's true.
It is. It is. And the FCA should be working extremely hard to make sure the regulatory environment of the city is better than it is, and using the opportunities which have been given us since we've left the EU. And, of course, that is beginning to happen, but it's happening far too slowly. And getting them involved and having them involved in this kind of situation, quasi-politically, is not an appropriate use of their time.
One thing that, I sort of came out 3 weeks ago as being debanked. And lots of others have followed. Oh, gosh, it's happened to us as well. And we learn, if you believe the FOI that was received by the Mail on Sunday at the weekend, that up to 1,000 bank accounts a day are being closed in this country. And it's predominantly to do with anti-money laundering rules that are excessive, that are being overinterpreted by compliance departments of banks, in my opinion. Big national debate about people being debanked has taken place over the last few weeks. Pages and pages of it in the newspapers. I haven't heard a word from the FCA.
It is extraordinary, isn't it?
Not a word.
It is extraordinary. I think it's a great shame. I have to say this, Nigel. I think that certainly I've worked with the predecessor to the FCA, the SIB and the FSA, and there's some extremely good people in there. There's no question that there are many, many good people who work in the FCA. The shame is that they, from time to time, get themselves involved in these issues to a far greater extent than they should, and that damages their reputation. I think in this particular case that they need to pull back and they need to start looking at, as it were, the sort of things which really concern us at the moment, as I said before, which is to improve the quality of regulation, to get rid of, for instance, the over-prescriptive regulation which we have had to put up with since we've been in the EU, the disproportionality of the regulation and so on. And there are movements now to do that, but it's taken a hell of a long time,
Well, yeah.
far too long.
And talking of the FCA, the previous boss of the FCA, of course, a chap called Andrew Bailey.
Yep.
Andrew Out to Lunch Bailey, as he was known in the city, went on to become the governor of the Bank of England. The Bank of England, which had regulated our banking system since 1694. Gordon Brown rather gave that authority away. But again, isn't it extraordinary that we're having a national debate about banking, about people's access to banking, about bank closures? Again, not a single utterance from the governor of the Bank of England.
I think that's a great shame too. I think it's difficult. I mean, certainly my experience of dealing with the Bank of England when I was running Life was that I met with them regularly.
Yeah.
And they knew exactly what was going on in the market. There are those who believe, and I actually believe too, that one of the big mistakes that Gordon Brown made was to separate regulation of the banks away from the Bank of England and put it in effect in the FSA.
No, I agree.
And that, of course, did create a situation where the role of the governor of the Bank of England, having also lost, as it were, not control, but been given independence of the Monetary Policy Committee, but had achieved that, but had lost the regulatory situation. It's a great shame that happened. That should have been rectified.
It's a mess. And now, of course, the bank will be back in the news tomorrow because interest rates will go up again, I think, for the 14th consecutive time. In short, final thought, Daniel Hodson. As you said yourself, it's Britain's biggest industry. It's our biggest earner of invisibles. Financial services is not just about Canary Wharf and the City of London. It's about Birmingham and Cardiff and Eastbourne and Newcastle.
It is.
Jobs everywhere.
Yeah.
It could be a lot better run than it is, couldn't it?
Are you saying the industry could be
The industry.
I don't think that's entirely true. I think it's extraordinary that our industry has managed to, our finance industry has managed to go as hard as it has. I was Deputy Chief Executive of Nationwide Building Society. I think that's an extraordinary fine institution and continues to be. It's a cooperative institution, it's very unusual. But I do think that a better regulatory environment, which we now have the opportunity to achieve, would create a much stronger industry. And we do depend on it. It employs, you say, over 1 million people.
Yeah.
It generates massive invisible earnings, which are very important to maintain the economy. And it's about time that we did something. And the wheels are moving, but they are not moving fast enough.
Well, perhaps I'm just a little bit wounded by the industry right at this moment in time.
Understandably.
Daniel Hodson, thank you.